nobody's smart enough to figure all this stuff out themselves, and anybody that tells you they are is probably wrong. Anywhere you have electricity, you can generate steam without having to burn fossil fuels. Now, the source of your electricity may be green or it may not be, but as you're separate from that problem, the grid can go and decarbonize and you'll get carbon-free electricity in time. If you can improve the efficiency of things that consume electricity, you're also reducing the magnitude of the challenge for energy transition because you're reducing the amount of legacy power generation sources that need to be replaced with new ones. So if you can reduce electrical consumption by 20%, then that's 20% less that you've got to figure out how to replace with wind, solar, or other things.
Welcome to the Diligent Observer from PitchFact. I'm your host, Andrew, and every week I share insights and strategies to help angel investors make better bets. My guest today is John Jeffers. John is an accomplished energy executive who has dedicated his 32-year career to tackling some of the sector's most critical emerging challenges. His journey spans global upstream oil and gas, technology, and strategic leadership roles with ExxonMobil, Schlumberger, and Southwestern Energy. Since leaving his corporate role in 2020, John is focused on helping early-stage companies succeed by mentoring and advising entrepreneurs on customer discovery, product development strategy, strategic partnership opportunities, fundraising, and building scalable businesses. John is a co-founder of Revolution Turbine Technologies, a waste energy recovery tech company aimed at decarbonizing natural gas operations. He's a member of Swan Impact Network, a Texas-based angel network, and is currently an executive in residence for the current cohort of the Rice Alliance Clean Energy Accelerator. He holds a bachelor's degree in geology from Dartmouth, a master's from Rice University, and has completed executive education coursework at SMU's Cox School of Business. John, it is truly a pleasure to have you with us today. Very much looking forward to our conversation.
Well, thanks, Andrew, and it's great to be here with you today. I always enjoy our conversations and the opportunity to share this with your broader audience.
There's a lot of directions we could go, but since our objective is to equip angels to make better bets, I'd love to start with how you got into angel investing over the last few years to begin with.
Sure. So going way back, I'm a geologist by training, and I worked my early career in oil and gas exploration, where like 1 out of 10 things we did was successful. And if you also know about geologists, if you got any friends that are geologists, we're famous for, you show me a piece of rock and I'll try to tell you the history of the world from it. So we're also used to, and really, generally have some capability to take very incomplete information and sort of fill in the gaps with conceptual models and analogies and pattern recognition, and at least come up with an answer that's good enough to move forward, knowing it's not right, and as a basis for learning. So that mindset carried me into early stage investing. And it's kind of a funny story. In my later years at Southwestern Energy, I would get a restricted stock grant every year and a little bit of cash bonus. And these restricted stock grants inevitably were worth far less by the time they vested than they were when they were granted. And I was, at the same time, I was interacting with startups in my role as an innovation lead and really liked what they were doing. And I thought, well, what if I put a little bit of my cash money to work investing in startups? Because it can't be possibly any worse of a bet than the company stock was at the time. and a true story. I mean, that's kind of how I came to it.
This is your downside protection. Oh man.
Well, it was just like, I might as well go to the casino and have fun,
Yeah.
and not that I look at angel investing or early stage investing as a gamble where the house is stacked against you. In fact, I think it's the opposite. But I had an opportunity to invest as an LP in a venture fund associated with the college that I graduated from. And it was nice because the management team of that fund was perfectly happy to give LPs sort of a co-pilot seat, look over their shoulders, see what they were doing, and also relied on us for domain expertise and things that they were investing in. So I kind of got a good view of, in general, how VCs think, how early stage investment works. And at some point really got the bug that, hey, there are a lot of companies that I interact with as a mentor and advisor. I'd like to take an even more active role and actually make investments on my own. So, really started probably the VC stuff in 2015, 2016, and made my first angel investment in 2020, I believe it was. So, and since then, been involved primarily through networks, through the Swan Impact Network, as you mentioned in the intro, also through the Dartmouth Angels, which is an angel network associated with the college that I got my undergraduate degree from. Those have been great sources of deal flow, but also great ways to learn from other angel investors who frankly have quite a bit more experience than I do.
Hmm. John, I don't know if you know this, but I was actually one class away from a geology minor. So I almost understand what you're talking about.
Well, that's great. That's great to hear. And sometimes I almost understand what I'm talking about too. So maybe we got more in common than you thought, Andrew.
What's funny is you're talking that whole, 1 in 10 bets being successful in your previous life sounds like it probably translates pretty well to the angel universe.
It really does, and you have to be comfortable that not everything that you place a bet on is going to turn out right. But you try to place smart bets, and you try to learn your way through each opportunity. So, on a
Hmm.
large exploration project, it wasn't a one-shot deal. We'd drill an initial well and learn from it. Likely it was a dry hole, but we'd also be sure that whatever we were doing gave us the maximum opportunity to learn, not just a yes, no, it worked or it didn't, but if it didn't work, why and what do we do next?
Hmm.
And I think that's an awful lot of the mindset of a startup, right? Almost every startup is going to have to make some strategic pivots along the way. And the real key for them is to do the learning early and do it fast and cheap so that they don't get way down the road with a concept that's just not going to work and can learn key things about maybe their technology, the market, customer preferences, and things like that before they start trying to scale their business.
I'd love if you could kind of walk through the taxonomy of your portfolio. What are the kind of deals that you're typically investing in?
First of all, my focus, even when I was still in the oil and gas industry, was on energy transition, meaning shifting from the current energy sources to new things like wind, solar, nuclear, whatever we want to talk about. But also, what can we do to reduce the environmental impact of the legacy energy sources, which are going to be with us for quite a while? So those are kind of the two areas that I primarily focus on. Although anybody who knows me and has seen my portfolio realizes that I stray out of my swim lane from time to time too when I see something that looks pretty interesting. But my core expertise and my core interest is in what I call clean energy and energy transition. Some of the things that I've focused on, and certainly some of the things I'm currently advising on in the clean energy accelerator, are things related to legacy oil and gas industry, things like mitigating methane emissions, monitoring mitigating methane emissions, which is a huge source of greenhouse gases and relatively easy to mitigate. It's also, in my portfolio, certain things that are driven at improving the efficiency of usage of fossil energy. So, a lot of the stuff that needs to be done in heavy industry, for instance, which one of the largest users of fossil fuels, whether it be oil, gas, or coal, is simply reducing the carbon footprint of those operations, which first and lowest hanging fruit is improving the efficiency, right? If you can improve the efficiency of a process and reduce the amount of fuel that's needed to power it, then you've de facto reduced the associated emissions. And I think that makes good sense, whether you're thinking about the legacy energy sources, fossil fuels, or the energy transition. Because even with electricity, if you can improve the efficiency of things that consume electricity, things like smart buildings and more efficient equipment, then you're also reducing the magnitude of the challenge for energy transition because you're reducing the amount of legacy power generation sources that need to be replaced with new ones. So if you can, reduce electrical consumption by 20%, then that's 20% less that you've got to figure out how to replace with wind, solar, or other things.
So you are kind of tackling the energy transition from a couple different angles. And I understand you're also pretty involved in Revolution turbine technologies. I'd love to hear a little bit more about that. How did you get plugged into that project?
Revolution's kind of it's an interesting story. It's a technology that's designed to provide remote electrical power for oil and gas operations by recovering pressure energy that would normally be dissipated through a valve or a regulator. There are a lot of places in oil and gas processes where a high pressure fluid, high pressure gas goes through some series of valves or regulators to reduce the pressure to be able to safely pass it into the next stage of a process. And, and that energy is lost. At the same time, there are a lot of needs for site electrical power that aren't easily met in remote locations because they don't have access to grid power. Often their power requirements on the magnitude where solar power is not practical, or simply they're in the wrong geography for solar power to be effective. And so then the only alternative really remaining for most companies was to burn oil and gas in some kind of a generator. We recognize that for the smaller amounts of electricity that are required for things like control systems, communication systems, things like that, that in many cases, this pressure energy was sufficient to power them. So we've developed a technology, and we're working to get it to market that'll make that connection. It'll take excess pressure energy, convert it to electricity. Nothing gets burned, nothing gets sent into the atmosphere. It just gets sent on down the process that it was going down anyhow. And then you've got power to, in some cases, handle remote monitoring so that you don't
Hmm.
have to have somebody drive to a well site to monitor it periodically. You do it by exception when you identify a fault, or to replace hydrocarbon emitting devices with electrical devices that again reduce the carbon footprint of the operation. So that's what Revolution's about, and that's on a very small scale kinds of things that I look at as an investor on a much larger scale when you think about bigger scale industrial decarbonization.
Hmm. So I did a little bit of analysis on your company actually before this call, and I realized, according to PitchBook, Revolution is categorized into what PitchBook considers alternative energy equipment.
Mhm.
And I did some breakdown just to see what venture investment into that category has looked like over the last couple of years. Apparently, there were around 416 deals in the alternative energy equipment space over the last 2 years as of August 1st, 2024, and a total of about $2.4 billion. And that's just in the US. So pretty significant capital deployment into early stage deals. That's specifically deals like under $50 million in size. So kind of smaller opportunities, emerging technologies similar to Revolution. So I'm curious how you have seen the alternative energy equipment space evolve over the last few years, because the energy transition more broadly, there's been a lot of what I'll call hype over the last few years. I don't think hype is it's probably not the right term, but there's been a lot of attention, at least from a broad scale, over the last decade or so.
There have been more and more forces coming to bear to drive this transition in power generation, in energy use, alternative power generation, however you want to characterize it. But 10 years ago, there were a few forward-looking companies, and I'm talking about end users, that were, recognized that this push might be coming, and also recognized that there were ways to do smart things that made economic sense from the end user standpoint on a pure economic basis, without subsidies, without regulatory mandates or anything. And in fact, when I was at Southwestern, we were looking at substantially reducing fugitive methane emissions for two reasons. We thought that it was the right thing to do because we wanted to be able to portray natural gas as a cleaner fossil energy source than coal. But if you're venting 2% of what you produce to the atmosphere and you look at the greenhouse gas impact of that, you're about on par with coal at best. So we wanted to be able to position ourselves as a cleaner energy source. Uh, but also, it just made economic sense. I mean, we were venting 2% of the product we were trying to sell. We were just letting it blow into the atmosphere. And there were a whole lot of things that we could do. It's sort of an 80-20 thing, but 80% of that or more could be tackled with things that actually made true economic sense, just in terms of capturing lost revenue.
Say more about that. You mentioned subsidies and you mentioned unit economics. Say more about why that is so important when considering investment in this space.
Yeah, well, I think it comes down to, what are your views on how much of the return, how much of the unit economics are what I call pure economics, and then what the overlay of subsidies is, subsidies, tax credits, things like that to, if you will, shift the unit economics relative to alternatives. So that's a big piece. And then the other piece that comes in some jurisdictions is sort of mandated adoption. So for instance, in the EV world, California has EV mandates. Certain, like federal government has certain EV mandates for their fleets. So there's mandates, and okay, somebody tells you you have to do something, you have to do it. The subsidies, I think, subsidies, tax credits, things like that. As an investor, I would prefer to see things that stand alone without subsidies and are a superior alternative without subsidies. And the reason for that, I think the subsidization is a good way to sort of kickstart adoption and provide some support to startups and other companies that are trying to develop new technologies and get them to market. But longer term, I believe that those technologies, those businesses have to be able to survive without the subsidies because the country, taxpayers can afford to provide subsidies for something that's at the margin, that's a 0.5% or 1% of whatever power generation market or anything like that. But as those things penetrate the market and go to scale, the cost of those subsidies just becomes overwhelming. And then what really happens is effectively your consumers are bearing the full cost. They may be paying part of it in terms of their purchase price of what they're buying, and the other half they're paying in taxes to support the subsidy. So at the end of the day, on aggregate, subsidized technologies, subsidized businesses become very expensive to society when that has to be done at full scale. So I like the idea of subsidies to bridge the gap. I don't like the idea of businesses that look like they're going to be perpetually dependent on
Mm.
on subsidies because I don't think that's sustainable.
I'm no expert in this space, but I have seen enough presentations and pitches from entrepreneurs working in this space that highlight how their technology fits into, for example, the Inflation Reduction
Mhm.
Act or some other specific package that's on the market right now. And they tout that as a significant advantage or tailwind. Talk me through like how you think about when an entrepreneur presents something like that. What are the questions that go on in your brain?
So, first of all, I think the Inflation Reduction Act, the infrastructure bill, all those things have been great for putting some momentum into a lot of these areas and putting a really big push. And as an investor, nothing I like more than putting $1 of my investment alongside 3 or 4 or $5 of non-dilutive grant money in an early stage company. I think that's fantastic, phenomenal. You talked about the 2.4 billion of early stage investment. I would suspect that since the IRA and infrastructure bills were passed, that a very significant chunk of that is going in alongside non-dilutive money, and very little of it's going into things that don't have access to that. Uh, but when I look at a deal, when I look at a pitch, I want to know clearly what are the unit economics with the subsidy? What are the unit economics without the subsidies, without the preferences? And then going forward, what is your plan to improve the economics, generally either lower the cost or improve the performance so that you can approach your subsidized economics in an unsubsidized world? Uh, because ultimately, energy is basically a commodity, and the willingness of consumers, end users voluntarily paying more for a commodity, it's hard to imagine long term that would be the case. Everybody has desires to make the world a better place, and everybody has desires to do the right thing. But at the end of the day, industries have margins that they need to preserve and protect, and consumers have household budgets they need to meet. So there's probably a small green premium that end users are really willing to pay in an ongoing basis, but it's not much. optimist on technology. I mean, as long as you're not violating, you will come up to hard limits on the laws of physics and things like that. But really, I'm an optimist on technology. I think we will get there. Better alternatives will rise to the top, and coal, oil, and natural gas may not be the best, most practical, most economic source of energy for ever and ever and ever. They weren't 150 years ago, and 50 years from now, quite likely they won't be either, particularly with with the emphasis and the push on developing alternative energy technologies.
Could you maybe give an example of a company in your portfolio or that you've been watching that you feel represents a really strong unit economic case?
Most industries, heavy industries, require heat for their operations, right? Anything from steel making to food processing to anything. In many of those industries, heat's in the form of steam. Steam is a great heat carrier, so it's frequently thermal energy is converted to steam. Steam can be moved around through their processes to heat things. And there are two companies that I think they're at different ends of the heat problem. One is a company called Imperium Technologies. They're currently based in Houston, I think. I know they're at Greentown Labs here in Houston. And they have basically re-engineered the control of steam traps. And what steam traps are they're basically low spots in a steam system that collect condensed water. And if there's condensed water in your steam system, you can't move steam through the pipes, right? You got to push the water through. So these steam traps basically drain the water out of the steam system so the steam can flow through more readily. And the traditional steam trap is just kind of like a spring-loaded mechanical device. And when you get water accumulating in a low spot, the steam pressure builds, and then it basically blows the water out of the steam trap. The thing theoretically closes, and then the system goes on its way. Well, what happens in reality is these things aren't very reliable, and they tend to stick open. And what will happen is, in addition to bleeding off the water that you intended to bleed off, you'll bleed off a bunch of the valuable steam, and you'll lose a lot of the heat energy that you're trying to transfer from your steam boiler to the point where you're using it. And in fact, the numbers are pretty staggering. Somewhere between 35 and 40% of fossil fuels are used to generate industrial steam. We think about cars and things like
Wow.
that, but when you think about coal and natural gas, maybe a little bit of it's oil, it's being used to generate steam in industrial settings. And about 20% of that steam is wasted through inefficient operation of steam traps. So what Imperium has done is they've developed a smart IoT-driven electrical actuator for steam traps that operates the steam traps throughout industrial setting efficiently. And it's a relatively low-cost retrofit and just makes tremendous sense in terms of managing existing steam systems more efficiently. So I didn't invest in that one. I think if I'd had the opportunity, I certainly would have been excited about that.
And
You know, it,
and it sounds like that would fit in your, as you described it earlier, you're improving the efficiency of
yeah, that's kind
legacy
of
systems
exactly. That's
bucket.
kind of that's in my efficiency thesis. On the other
Yeah.
side, and one that I did invest in is a company called Skyven Technologies, I believe they're called. And Skyven wanted to reimagine how industrial steam is generated and look for carbon-free ways to generate industrial steam. And where the name of the company came from, Skyven, their original concept was to use focused solar energy to generate steam. So basically, like an array of mirrors focusing the sun onto, uh, like think of the witch's cauldron, right? It's boiling, but focus a bunch of heat on a vessel containing water and boil it to make steam. And great idea, except that's a pretty massive retrofit to put into an industrial setting, and it didn't really have legs. So the original concept didn't make it, but they still saw the value, still saw the need. The problem they were trying to solve hadn't gone away. It's just maybe the initial solution wasn't the right one. And what they came up with instead was a heat pump that generates steam temperature. So most heat pumps, that you think of using HVAC systems, you can heat your house to 70, 80 degrees or from 30 or 40 degrees outside. or you can cool it from 100 degrees down to 70 or whatever you want to do. They identified and are taking to market a technology that actually takes the heat pump, and so it's an electrically driven device that can generate steam. And what that means is all of a sudden, anywhere you have electricity, you can generate steam without having to burn fossil fuels. Now, the source of your electricity may be green or it may not be, but as you're separate from that problem, the grid can go and decarbonize and you'll get carbon-free electricity in time. What I liked about it was two things. It is very cost competitive with fossil fuels on a unit cost basis, partly because the process is more efficient than combustion, and the process is a lot more efficient than just electric resistive heater, which would be the other way. Like think of an electric tea kettle or something like that. The heat pump is significantly more efficient. So, and it's an easy retrofit, much easier retrofit for a company because it really can plug in place of or alongside a traditional steam generation system. So customers would have the option of installing this in place of their gas-fired burners. Probably because they already have the gas-fired burners, they leave them in place and make them backups to the heat pump system. But it just seemed like a neat way to transition industrial heat from electricity easily and efficiently and cost effectively.
And it sounds like that would fit pretty squarely in your other macro
Exactly,
thesis.
exactly.
I love this. I love
Yeah,
this.
so they fit together and they're complementary, right? The efficiency improvements reduce the load that new sources need to carry. They also reduce the environmental impact, the power, the energy requirements today. So if you're using an energy source that hasn't been decarbonized yet, at least you're using less of it. And the other thing about the efficiency improvement things is most of them are relatively low investments for the end users. It's not a full retrofit of their operation. It's introducing maybe an advanced control system or replacing a particular component in their system with something that operates more efficiently, like the steam traps. So, because that is a big barrier to adoption, right? Particularly in industrial settings.
Specifically, the cost to retrofit.
So if you think about it, industries invest capital in equipment and systems that have, 20, 30, 40, 50-year life. So unless they're near the end of the useful life of a piece of equipment, it's a big sort of redundant cost to replace something that's still within its useful service life. So that,
Right, because then you break the economics of your original investment,
yeah,
which were contingent on X years of
yeah.
operation.
And of course, your shareholders don't really care whether you broke the old investment or the new one. They just look at the aggregate and say, well, you're less capital efficient than you used to be. And a lot of these industrial businesses operate on relatively thin margins because they may be producing a commodity that all their competitors are providing. So their main competitive advantages are either they have a lower cost structure or for whatever reason, they satisfy their customers better by delivering the commodity, better customer service, faster delivery, higher quality, whatever. So yeah, that is a big, big deal. And that's where also driving adoption can sometimes not be so much about the technology, but more about the business model under which it's delivered. And another company that I really, really like is a company called Canon Energy, Kanin. And Janice Tran is the CEO there. They're out of Canada. And their business is waste heat recovery from industrial operations. So basically using a heat exchanger to recover heat from, can be anything from engine exhaust to, again, some part of an industrial process that has heat that would otherwise just be dissipated to the environment. That can be recovered and used to drive organic Rankine cycle power generation system. And in terms of overall economics, you can generate power in ideal situations for same or less than folks are buying power for. On the surface, it says, oh, that makes really good sense for an industrial company to invest in this kind of technology because then they could self-generate power and it wouldn't cost them any more, might cost them less than the power they're already buying from the grid. The problem is the capital expenditure to do that is quite high. And most industries, they would consider that to be discretionary capital, right? Well, if I can buy electricity for $6 a kilowatt hour, why am I going to invest $500 million to be able to produce my own electricity for 5 or 6 cents a kilowatt hour. It doesn't really make sense. So what Janus and Canon have done is they've basically set this up under power purchase agreements, and they finance the implementation of the system and sell the power to the industrial user, so that the industrial user doesn't have to commit capital. All they have to do is agree to buy the power. It's not a new technology. The technology's been around for a long, long time. It's not very frequently adopted because, for exactly the reason I stated, right? It's just doesn't really fit in the stack of capital investments that industries want to make.
So the competitive advantage in that case that you saw was the business model.
Yeah, it's an enabler for easy adoption, and of course, the end user still gets the benefit of incorporating green power into their operations, zero emission power into their operations by using their own waste energy. It's just they didn't have to make the investment, the capital investment to make that happen.
You've talked through three similar kind of in the heat universe deals. Let's say you were speaking to a newer angel interested in this space. What are 1 to 3 of the key questions that you would encourage an angel to ask of a company in this space, or when considering an opportunity in this space, that might not apply to your standard SaaS opportunity or a CPG product? Like, what are some of the unique questions that an investor should ask when evaluating a deal in this universe?
Sure. One of the things is really understanding the totality of the situation from the customer's perspective. Like, what are the issues associated with integration of a new technology into their operation? In other words, if you want to put a technology into an industrial setting, it doesn't exist in isolation. It's connected into the rest of their process. And so really having a clear understanding of what all of the interface and integration type issues are with introducing a new technology into an existing operation, that's one. And the other one is, what are the trade-offs that the customers want to make, and where does sustainability fit with cost, reliability, and those kinds of things. So really understanding customer priorities, because there are a lot of cool technologies out there, right? There are a lot of cool technologies. And I think what separates the startup that just has a cool technology from the ones that are going to be really successful businesses is, how well do they understand the problem they're trying to solve on the customer's end? And how well do they understand how the way they're trying to solve it stacks up against other ways the company could be solving it that might not look anything like what they're doing? So it might be very indirect competitors, particularly with the sustainability stuff. I mean, a lot of companies now, most enterprises are pursuing decarbonization. They're pursuing reduction of their carbon footprint. And they have multiple opportunities throughout their enterprise for where they can do that. So while you may think you're solving a problem with industrial emissions from their industrial heat production process, what they're really trying to do is solve an overall corporate reduction in carbon footprint. And they're going to look, many of them are going to look in terms of, okay, where can I get the most decarbonization per dollar invested? Not how am I going to reduce the carbon footprint of my industrial heat? So you may well find that you have a great technology that looks on paper like it makes sense. And you may wonder, well, why aren't they adopting this? Well, it may be that they have a much easier pathway to reducing, their carbon emissions by pick a number, 100,000 tons a year by repurposing their vehicle fleet, changing
completely ancillary, like
unrelated. Yeah. And converting their delivery truck fleet to EVs or something like that may turn out to be a better use of their capital for decarbonization than messing with the heat side of their business. Understanding what the company is really trying to achieve, what the customer is trying to achieve at the very high level. But then you still got to drill it all the way down to the operations level, because at the end of the day, if you're going to do something that impacts operations, you're going to need to understand the impact. So I really like to look for founders that get that. Some of them don't start off with it, which is fine, but they have the curiosity and
Mm.
the awareness that they need to work on that. And then, and I think those are the ones that tend to be pretty successful in building businesses because they are willing to pivot when they learn.
Mm.
Others that are kind of technology first and struggle to deeply understand what's driving their customers' decision-making processes. I think they struggle and they often end up better positioned as a technology developer that sells through an intermediary, and it's the intermediary that's really finding the solution space for 'em.
I want to come back to your first question. You said it's very important for an investor to really wrap their mind around how does this technology or proposed technology integrate into the end user's process and business. That seems really difficult to do. Like if I'm selling a steam trap device into a industrial power company, like there's a huge amount of information to wrap my mind around. Even if I'm very versed in this
Sure.
space, how do you, maybe a little bit more tactically, like how do you actually go about answering those questions?
Well, yeah, generally I go ask somebody that knows more about it than I do. I mean,
Okay.
that's the short answer, right? You find
Yeah.
somebody that does know something about it. I know a lot of people who know a lot of people, and I'm not shy to pick up a phone and call somebody and just ask and learn enough myself to understand whether what I'm being told by a startup makes sense or not. I generally, on key aspects of a startup's technology or business plan, I would advise any angel, just don't take the startup's word for it, right? Ask a few questions of people who might understand the other side of the story as well. So I think that's probably one of my biggest early lessons. And I learned this from riding shotgun with other people, not, I mean, probably would have done it on my own anyhow, but how critical that is to get connected to people that understand the customer side of it, or other people that are investing in the space who can talk about what are some of the traps you need to look out for. Nobody's smart enough to figure all this stuff out themselves, and anybody that tells you they are is wrong. And even if you're the smartest guy in the room, right? I'll give that to you. But regardless of how smart you are on almost any subject, there's somebody or some group of people that collectively know more than you do, right? And so as an investor, often I feel it's like my job is to go find those, right? And
Mm.
track down answers.
John, I'm curious if there are any specific trends or things happening in the industry right now that are really interesting to you, given your experience.
Yeah, I'm glad you asked that because we spent a whole lot of time talking about industrial decarbonization, and I think that's a great space. One of the things that I find very interesting for the future, and it's got some momentum already, but I don't think it's quite on the right track yet, is hydrogen as a fuel. And there's been a lot of talk about hydrogen. There's been a lot of investment into hydrogen. But today, I think it's not where it needs to end up. So I'm really interested in people that are thinking beyond electrolysis. So using excess solar and wind power to split water into hydrogen and oxygen, or taking the current steam methane reforming sort of refinery technology to making hydrogen, and then taking the CO2 emissions and putting them away underground in carbon sequestration. The first one I don't like, the green hydrogen from electrolysis, I don't particularly like because I think we're going to need all the clean electricity we can produce going to the grid to satisfy electrical demand. And this idea that we're going to have lots of virtually free green electricity that we can use to split water, I think is probably not realistic long term. And even so, the capital costs of electrolyzers and things like that are quite a bit higher or significant. So that never becomes really low cost hydrogen.
Which comes back
Um,
to the unit economics you were talking about earlier.
exactly. Exactly. So two technologies that one technology and one other avenue that I really like. There's been work going on for many years on, rather than splitting water molecules to get hydrogen, is splitting methane molecules to get hydrogen. So basically, it's electrolysis or pyrolysis of methane. And then you separate, if you can do it in the right environment and the right circumstances, rather than producing CO2, you'll produce hydrogen and solid carbon. And we all know solid carbon has a lot of potential uses. And then obviously the hydrogen does. And what I really like about it is just the basic physics behind it. Is it takes significantly less energy to split a methane molecule than to split a water molecule. It's a needle moving number. It's not 5% or 8%. It's a lot. So that provides just a natural physics-based advantage to the process. And at the same, you've got the potential to produce not just hydrogen that has value, but a carbon product on the other end that has value. So there are a lot of people working on that with different technologies. I would stay tuned on that because I think ultimately that's going to be maybe the preferred way to produce clean hydrogen. It's just there's a lot of work to do to get those various processes that are being explored from laboratory scale to a practical economic scale.
And is the technology development the primary barrier, in your opinion, to that happening? Because if it's materially more efficient, then my first question is, why isn't it already being done?
Yeah, well, part of it, part of the reason it's not already being done is part of the overall hydrogen problem is the market's not really developed for
Mm.
hydrogen yet on the back end. So I mean, there's some of that, and then the other side of it is a lot of this stuff is being done at lab scale processes where you can maybe produce a few kilograms of hydrogen a day. It's not the technology so much, but the processes. There's some challenges in scaling those up, but I think those are challenges that can be met. And the beauty of it is, though, is that just the underlying physics says that if we can figure out how to do this at scale, it's a more efficient process than electrolysis of water from an energy input standpoint. So I like that one. The other thing, and this goes back to my early days as an exploration geologist, there's an emerging business or emerging pursuit for naturally occurring hydrogen in the subsurface, where hydrogen is accumulated in the subsurface in a similar manner to oil and gas. And there are several, at least one of these actually being produced. It kind of became widely publicly known 2 or 3 years ago. And there's a great chase off now to explore for hydrogen in places where it might be occurring. And that would be a real game changer as well, just on the cost side, because in any industrial process to produce hydrogen, really, really, really difficult to imagine getting the cost of hydrogen down to or below $1 a kilogram, almost no matter what you do. And I know there's government-sponsored moonshots to try to break the buck on hydrogen production, but nowhere close at this point. And since all those processes require energy input, cheap energy is always going to be one of the requirements to get to low cost hydrogen. Whereas exploring for it and producing it in the same way you would oil and gas, very real possibility of getting hydrogen produced for 50 cents a kilogram, 50 to 75 cents a kilogram. And the real question is, okay, there are a small handful of naturally occurring hydrogen deposits found around the world. All of them were found totally by accident, right? They were found in the course of exploring for something else. The one in Africa that's currently being produced to provide power to a small town in Mali, I think it is, found it when people were trying to drill a water well and they couldn't understand why the water well blew up, right? I mean, they found hydrogen. And then trace amounts of hydrogen and then significant amounts of hydrogen found in the course of exploring for oil and gas or exploring for helium or other things. So there really has not yet been a deliberate exploration effort for hydrogen. It does not occur in the same kinds of places in general that you'd look for oil and gas. So I think that's a wild frontier right now, but I keep eyes on it for the next decade or so and see where it goes. There are a number of startup exploration companies around the world that are pursuing this. I just think that was really interesting too. So I do think hydrogen holds a lot of promise as a fuel in the future. And I think the question is, how's that hydrogen going to be sourced? And
So,
again, what's going to be the most economical way to source it?
so it sounds like the timing, perhaps, on investments into hydrogen more broadly is very important. And to think about, is the market fully developed for whatever small sliver of technology is being developed by that company? Like, where does the market stand?
Yeah.
In your projections, where are you imagining the market will stand? Because if you're expecting growth of this level and reality is lower, what does that do for your growth?
And I think that honestly, I think the demand growth is going to be largely dependent on the price of hydrogen.
Hmm.
And if hydrogen can be priced competitively to other fuels, I think the demand will increase faster. it's still going to be one of these issues where if I have a brand new vehicle that's not a hydrogen producing vehicle or hydrogen consuming vehicle, hydrogen fuel vehicle, I'm not going to ditch that
Mm,
tomorrow, and it's gonna have to come into my normal replacement cycle.
yep.
Um, but I also think that that's the reason that most of the focus on hydrogen so far has been to continue to use hydrogen from steam methane reforming, which is the current technology that produces the vast majority of hydrogen that's produced in the world. Is produced within refineries and petrochemical plants that generally consume most of that hydrogen for their internal use, but can produce excess to sell,
Hmm.
uh, and use that to develop the demand side. And then once the demand side is growing, then to start supplementing that and eventually replacing it with cleaner hydrogen sources. But it is another one of these chicken and egg problems, right? The market's got to move with the demand side's got to move for people to get excited about the supply side, and vice versa. Who's going to build a big demand structure without clear line of sight on supply? So it's
Always a fascinating question.
yeah,
Which comes
but
first?
a lot of people working hard on that problem. And I just wanted to point out those two areas that I think are most interesting to me, which is hydrogen from methane and natural hydrogen from subsurface exploration.
Anyone specific that is pioneering or that you're specifically watching in one or both of those
Yeah,
categories?
there there are literally dozens of companies working on the methane to hydrogen problem, and a lot of that is tightly tied to academic research. So I don't have a list of companies in front of me, but quite a few of those. And if you attend like any of the sort of energy technology conferences, like the Rice Alliance Energy Venture Forum, every year for the past 3 or 4 years, there have been several in that space that have pitched and presented. On the natural hydrogen exploration space, there's a company called Koloma, Koloma, that's being funded by Breakthrough Energy Ventures. They're probably out at the forefront, but they're just one of many based here. There's Canadian companies, Australian, European companies pursuing that.
Well, John, this has been super helpful. Any other words of wisdom or lessons learned that you want to share from your experience so far in the space?
I think at the end of the day, you can be really analytical in evaluating a venture deal, an angel deal in any space. And the temptation in the deep tech, hard tech world is to focus on those things in particular, where you can sort of do a deep objective dive into technologies. But at the end of the day, I think what separates the successful from the unsuccessful, you know, technology is table stakes. You got to have a technology that
Mm,
works to even be in the game, but that's not enough. And so I do think a lot of it comes down to really understanding the dynamics of the market, the mindset of the customers, and probably more importantly than any of that, the founding team and their mindset and kind of what makes them tick, what motivates them, how they respond to adversity. And then at the end of the day, there is just quite a bit of subjectivity and gut feel that goes into a
mm.
deal that passes muster on every objective measure you can make. And then there's still that subjective gut check at the end. Do I really believe that this is something that's got a decent chance of being successful?
Fantastic. John, how can our audience stay connected to you?
Best way to connect with me is through LinkedIn. I check LinkedIn daily. So if you message me through LinkedIn, you can follow me on LinkedIn. I haven't been real active in posting lately because I've been so busy with other things, but,
You got a couple of things going on.
yeah, I got a few things going on, and I do have a sort of a personal consulting advisory business called Foreland Innovation. We don't have a website stood up yet, but I'll certainly, when we do that, that'll be posted on LinkedIn. Yeah.
Fantastic. Well, John, this has been a pleasure. Thank you so much for your time.
Pleasure as always, Andrew.